July 4th, 1968. Bumpy Johnson collapsed at his favorite restaurant. As he lay dying, only one man held his hand. Not his lawyers, not his bodyguards. A young driver named Frank Lucas. In that moment, Bumpy whispered something that would turn Frank into the most dangerous drug lord in American history. Those final words cost thousands of lives. But to understand what Bumpy said and why it mattered, we need to go back 2 years. Back to the day a hungry kid from North Carolina walked into Harlem with nothing but $40 and a dream. Back to the moment when the Godfather of Harlem made the biggest mistake of his life. He trusted Frank Lucas. The streets of Harlem were alive with celebration that Independence Day. Children running through open fire hydrants. Families gathering on stoops to watch fireworks explode over Manhattan. But inside Wells' restaurant on 7th Avenue, there were no celebrations. Bumpy Johnson, the 63-year-old Godfather of Harlem, sat at his favorite corner table, eating fried chicken when his fork suddenly clattered against the plate. His left hand moved to his chest, his face twisted in agony. And then the most powerful black gangster in American history collapsed onto the floor. Waiters froze in place. Customers screamed for help. But one man moved faster than everyone else. A tall, quiet figure in his late 30s, who had been sitting across from Bumpy, dropped to his knees, cradled the old man's head in his hands, and leaned close to hear his final words. His name was Frank Lucas. And what Bumpy whispered to him in those dying moments would set in motion a chain of events that would flood America with heroin, destroy thousands of lives, and turn the very community Bumpy had protected into a wasteland of addiction and death. To understand what happened that night and why it mattered, we need to go back 2 years. Back to the spring of 1966, when a hungry young man from rural North Carolina stepped off a Greyhound bus at the Port Authority terminal in Manhattan. Frank Lucas was 36 years old, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that had picked tobacco and thrown punches in equal measure. He carried a small duffel bag containing everything he owned and $41 in his pocket. No job waited for him in New York, no family connections, no plan except one burning ambition that had driven him north from the cotton fields of LaGrange. Frank Lucas wanted to be somebody, not just somebody who survived paycheck to paycheck, somebody who mattered, somebody whose name made people stop talking when he walked into a room. Back in North Carolina, black men did not become somebody. They picked crops for white farmers who called them boy. They stepped off sidewalks when white women approached. They said yes, sir, and no, sir, and died poor without anyone remembering their names. Frank had rejected that life completely. He had drifted through the South running small cons and learning the art of the hustle. But he knew the South would never give him what he truly wanted. Harlem in 1966 was the center of black America. It was culture and commerce, jazz clubs and churches, hope and despair, all packed into a few square miles of Upper Manhattan. It was also the undisputed center of black organized crime in the United States. And sitting at the very top of that world was one man whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and reverence throughout the city. Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. Bumpy. The nickname came from a bump on the back of his head, a childhood injury that never properly healed. But over the decades, the name had taken on an entirely different meaning in the streets. Bumpy was the obstacle you simply could not get around. The immovable force that had defeated Dutch Schultz's assassination squads during the bloody wars of the 1930s. The brilliant strategist who had negotiated face-to-face with Lucky Luciano and lived to tell about it. The survivor who had endured 11 brutal years in Alcatraz and returned to reclaim his throne without firing a single shot. At 61 years old, Bumpy Johnson had been running Harlem's underworld for more than 3 decades. He had outlasted every rival, every threat, every attempt to remove him from power. Frank Lucas knew all of this before he ever set foot in New York. He had heard the stories down south. Everyone had heard the stories. Frank spent his first weeks in Harlem, learning the landscape like a soldier studying enemy territory. He rented a tiny room in a boarding house on 127th Street for $7 a week. He walked the streets from morning until night, watching everything, listening to everyone, memorizing every detail. He learned which corners belonged to which crews and which restaurants served as fronts for the numbers operation. He learned which police officers gladly took bribes and which ones actually tried to enforce the law. He learned the rhythms of Harlem the way a predator learns the patterns of prey. But mostly he learned about Bumpy Johnson. Frank heard stories about how Bumpy paid rent for widows who could not afford it and bought groceries for families when fathers lost their jobs. He heard how Bumpy settled disputes between neighbors without anyone getting hurt, and how he protected local businesses from Italian crews trying to extort them. The people of Harlem did not see Bumpy as a criminal. They saw him as their protector, a man who stood between them and the wolves from downtown who wanted to exploit them. Bumpy Johnson was Harlem's shield. Frank understood something important then. Power here was not just about money and muscle. It was about love. The first time Frank saw Bumpy in person, his entire understanding of power changed forever. It was a Tuesday morning in early May. Frank had learned that Bumpy ate breakfast at the same small restaurant on 125th Street every single day, without exception. Frank positioned himself at the counter, nursing a cup of coffee he could barely afford, and waited. At exactly 8:15, the front door opened. The entire restaurant shifted. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Waitresses stood a little straighter behind the counter. And then Bumpy Johnson walked in. He was not a physically imposing man. 5'8", maybe 170 pounds, wearing a simple gray suit that was well-tailored but not flashy. His hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face was lined with age and decades of hard experience. He looked like someone's grandfather walking in for his morning meal. But when Bumpy Johnson moved through that restaurant, every single person watched him pass. He did not demand attention through loud words or aggressive posturing. He simply commanded it through presence alone. Bumpy sat at a corner table with clear sightlines to both exits. A waitress brought coffee without being asked. He opened his newspaper and began to read. No bodyguards surrounded him. No guns were visible. Just an old man, eating breakfast. Yet somehow the most dangerous man in the room. Frank watched Bumpy for 3 full hours that morning, observing everything from his seat at the counter. He watched people approach the corner table, lean down to whisper urgent requests, and walk away with solutions to problems Frank could only imagine. He watched a young mother bring her teenage son to meet Bumpy, and he watched Bumpy hand the nervous boy a $20 bill while telling him to stay in school and make something of himself. He watched 2 men who clearly despised each other sit down at Bumpy's table as enemies and leave 20 minutes later shaking hands like old friends. Bumpy Johnson was not just a gangster running a criminal enterprise. He was a judge who settled disputes, a banker who provided loans when regular banks refused, a counselor who gave advice to the lost, and a king who ruled through respect rather than fear. Frank understood then that getting close to this man would be the most difficult thing he had ever attempted. Bumpy had survived 30 years in the most dangerous business in America precisely because he did not trust strangers. He did not give second chances to people who disappointed him. 100 ambitious young men had probably tried to infiltrate Bumpy's inner circle. Most had failed completely. Some had ended up dead. Frank would need to be different. He would need to prove himself in a way that Bumpy could not possibly ignore. And then fate handed him exactly the opportunity he needed. 3 weeks later, Frank was walking down Lenox Avenue around 9 in the evening when he heard shouting erupting from a narrow alley between 2 buildings. He almost kept walking without stopping. In Harlem, getting involved in other people's problems was an excellent way to end up bleeding in a gutter. But something made him pause at the alley entrance. Maybe it was the desperate sound of someone crying out for help. Maybe it was some instinct he could not name. Frank stepped into that dark alley and found three Italian men in expensive suits systematically beating a skinny young black man who could not have been older than 19. The kid was curled up on the filthy ground in a fetal position, trying to protect his head with his arms while the men kicked him viciously. One of the Italians was shouting about money that was owed, about respect that had been disrespected, about teaching these people a lesson they would never forget. Frank did not know who the bleeding kid was. He did not know that the cash stuffed in the kid's jacket pocket belonged to Bumpy Johnson's numbers operation. He did not know these three attackers worked for a crew from East Harlem. All Frank knew was that three grown men were savagely beating a child. What happened next took less than 30 seconds of explosive violence. Frank Lucas had been fighting his entire life simply to survive. In the tobacco fields of North Carolina, fighting meant the difference between life and death. You learned to hit first and hit hard because hesitation got you killed or crippled. Frank did not hesitate now. He grabbed the nearest Italian by the back of his collar and slammed his face into the brick wall with tremendous force. The man's nose shattered on impact, and he dropped unconscious before he hit the ground. The second attacker spun around, his hand reaching frantically for something tucked in his waistband, but Frank was already moving. A devastating right hook connected with the man's jaw and sent him spinning sideways into a pile of metal garbage cans that clattered loudly in the night. The third Italian tried to run for the street. Frank caught him by the back of his expensive jacket, spun him around, and delivered 3 rapid punches directly to his face. Nose broken, cheekbone cracked. The man collapsed in a heap next to his unconscious friends. The entire fight was over before the kid on the ground had even stopped trembling. Frank looked down at the 3 bleeding Italians, then at the terrified teenager. "You all right, kid?" The young man's name was Jerome, and he worked as one of Bumpy Johnson's numbers runners, responsible for collecting bets from a 3-block radius near Lenox Avenue every single day. Jerome ran straight from that alley to Bumpy's office above a barbershop on 135th Street, still bleeding from his split lip, his shirt torn and dirty from the beating. He burst through the office door without knocking and told Bumpy everything in a breathless rush. About the 3 Italian enforcers who had ambushed him in the alley. About the tall stranger with the southern accent who had appeared out of nowhere like some kind of avenging angel and destroyed all 3 attackers in less than a minute using nothing but his bare fists. About how this mysterious man had asked nothing in return for his help, wanted no reward or recognition, just told Jerome to get out of there, and then disappeared back into the Harlem night like a ghost. Bumpy listened to this entire story without any visible expression on his weathered face. When Jerome finally finished talking, Bumpy asked only one simple question. "Would you recognize this man if you saw him again on the street?" Jerome nodded immediately. "Yes, sir. I would never forget that face." "Find him," Bumpy said quietly. "Bring him to me." 2 days later, Jerome spotted Frank walking out of a grocery store on 127th Street, carrying a small paper bag of food. He approached carefully, nervously explained that someone very important wanted to meet him, and asked if Frank would be willing to come right now. Frank had been waiting for exactly this moment since the night he stepped off that Greyhound bus. He had not saved Jerome out of pure altruism. He had recognized an opportunity when he saw one and seized it with both hands. Frank agreed immediately and followed Jerome through the Harlem streets to a modest building on 135th Street. The meeting took place in Bumpy's office on the 2nd floor. It was a surprisingly humble space, nothing like the lavish headquarters Frank had imagined for the most powerful gangster in Harlem. A worn wooden desk covered with neat stacks of papers, 2 simple chairs for visitors, a small window overlooking the busy street below. Framed photographs on the wall showed Bumpy standing with famous musicians, local politicians, and people Frank did not recognize. Bumpy himself sat behind the desk, perfectly still, watching as Frank entered the room and closed the door behind him. Neither man spoke for what felt like an eternity. Bumpy was studying Frank the way a master jeweler studies a rough diamond, searching carefully for hidden flaws and weaknesses. Frank stood completely still under this intense scrutiny and let himself be examined without flinching or looking away. He understood instinctively that this silent moment was itself a test, the first of many tests that would determine his entire future. Finally, Bumpy gestured to one of the empty chairs across from his desk. "Sit down." Frank sat. "Jerome told me what you did in that alley," Bumpy said. His voice was quiet and measured, nothing like the booming authority Frank had somehow expected from a man of his legendary reputation. 3 of Gino Palazzo's boys. You put all of them in the hospital with your bare hands. Bumpy paused and studied Frank's face for any reaction. "Why did you do it?" Frank considered his answer very carefully before speaking. He knew that whatever he said next would either open a door or close it forever. "Because it was the right thing to do," Frank said simply. Bumpy's weathered face did not change expression, but something subtle shifted behind his dark eyes. Interest, perhaps. Or maybe recognition of something familiar. "Most men would have walked right past that alley without stopping," Bumpy observed. "Getting involved in problems that do not concern you is dangerous business in this city." Frank met his gaze directly without wavering. "Most men do not want to be somebody," Frank replied. A ghost of a smile flickered across Bumpy's face and disappeared just as quickly. "You want to be somebody, is that right?" Frank nodded slowly. "I want to learn from somebody who already is." This answer seemed to genuinely please Bumpy. He leaned back in his worn leather chair and studied Frank for another long, silent moment, weighing something invisible in his mind. "Where are you from originally?" Bumpy asked. "North Carolina. A small town called LaGrange. You probably never heard of it." "And what did you do down there in LaGrange?" "Picked tobacco mostly. Ran numbers for a local man on the side. Small-time country stuff, nothing serious." "Why did you leave and come all the way up here?" "Because small time was never going to be enough for me." Bumpy nodded slowly at this answer, as if it confirmed something he had already suspected. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a set of car keys attached to a simple metal ring. He tossed the keys across the desk to Frank, who caught them without looking down. "Starting tomorrow morning you drive me," Bumpy said. 6 o'clock sharp until I say we are done for the day. You watch everything I do. You listen to everything I say. You keep your mouth shut unless I ask you a direct question, understand?" Frank closed his fingers around the keys. "Yes, sir. I understand completely." The next morning, Frank Lucas arrived at Bumpy Johnson's apartment building on Sugar Hill at 5:30, a full half hour before he was expected. The car was a 1965 Cadillac sedan DeVille, black as midnight with cream-colored leather interior that smelled of expensive cigars and old money. Frank spent 20 minutes polishing the already immaculate exterior until every chrome surface gleamed like a mirror in the early morning light. At exactly 6 o'clock, he stood waiting beside the rear passenger door, holding it open with his back straight and his eyes forward. Bumpy emerged from the building wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a gray fedora tilted at a precise angle. He paused briefly to examine the car, then glanced at Frank's polished shoes and the careful way he held the door without being asked, a small nod of approval. Over the next 2 years, Frank Lucas became Bumpy Johnson's shadow. He drove Bumpy to meetings with city politicians who smiled warmly while accepting thick envelopes of cash under the table. He waited outside closed doors while Bumpy negotiated complex arrangements with Italian mob representatives who wanted bigger pieces of Harlem's lucrative numbers operation. He watched silently as Bumpy settled violent disputes between rival crews, never raising his voice above a conversational tone, never making explicit threats, simply speaking quiet, reasonable words until everyone in the room agreed to peace. Frank absorbed everything he witnessed, like a sponge soaking up water. He learned how the numbers racket actually functioned from the street level up to the counting houses. He learned which police captains could be trusted to stay bought, and which ones would take your money and betray you anyway. He learned the names of every important player in Harlem's underworld and the complicated web of alliances, rivalries, and debts that connected them all. But the most valuable lessons were not about criminal mechanics. They were about something far more important. They were about the nature of power itself and how it was wielded by a master who understood that fear alone could never build anything that lasted. Bumpy Johnson had an unbreakable code that governed every aspect of his life and business operations. He paid his debts on time without exception. He kept his word even when keeping it cost him significant money or advantage. He protected people who could not protect themselves from predators who would exploit them. And above all else, he absolutely refused to allow hard drugs to be sold in Harlem under any circumstances whatsoever. The numbers game is just gambling, Bumpy explained to Frank one afternoon, while they sat in the back of the Cadillac waiting for a meeting. People bet whatever small amount they can afford to lose. If they win, they can pay their rent or buy shoes for their children. If they lose, they simply try again next week hoping for better luck. Nobody dies from playing the numbers. Nobody becomes a slave to their own desperate body. Heroin is completely different, Bumpy continued, his voice turning cold and hard as iron. Heroin takes everything a person has, their money, their health, their family, their dignity, their very soul. I have watched heroin destroy more lives than all the violent wars I have ever fought combined. I will not let that poison destroy Harlem, not while I still draw breath. Frank listened to these words and nodded solemnly. He said all the right things in response, but inside his mind, Frank was performing calculations of an entirely different nature than what Bumpy imagined. He looked at the numbers operation and estimated how much more money could potentially be made selling drugs instead of running gambling slips. He watched Bumpy turn away profitable opportunities because they conflicted with his precious moral code and saw weakness rather than strength in those decisions. He heard Bumpy speak passionately about protecting the community and thought coldly about how much easier and more profitable it would be to exploit that same community instead of defending it. Frank Lucas was indeed learning everything that Bumpy Johnson could teach him, but he was not learning the lessons Bumpy actually intended to teach. Frank was learning organizational structure and supply chain management and the critical importance of loyal personnel. He was learning how to build a criminal empire from the ground up, an empire that would operate without arbitrary moral limits, without self-imposed restrictions, without any conscience whatsoever. He was patiently learning how to do everything Bumpy Johnson refused to do, and waiting for the day when Bumpy would no longer be around to stop him. By early 1968, Bumpy Johnson was visibly declining, and everyone around him could see it plainly. His heart, weakened by decades of accumulated stress and violent struggle, was slowly failing inside his chest. He moved much slower now than he had even a year ago. He tired easily and needed frequent rest. He spent more time sitting in restaurants reminiscing about the old days, and less time actively walking the streets of his kingdom. The vultures, who had been waiting in the shadows, began circling closer. Italian crews started testing territorial boundaries again, pushing into neighborhoods they had quietly abandoned years before. Young, aggressive hustlers from Harlem's housing projects talked openly and disrespectfully about the old man finally losing his iron grip on power. Rivals who had remained silent for decades began making cautious, exploratory moves. Frank watched all of this developing situation with cold, detached calculation. He continued to play his assigned role as the loyal driver and devoted student with flawless dedication, but he was also making secret plans of his own. He had spent 2 years studying Bumpy's entire operation from the inside with complete access. He knew every lieutenant personally, every counting house location, every route the money traveled. He knew exactly how he would rebuild this kingdom. And then, on July 4th, 1968, Frank Lucas finally got exactly what he had been patiently waiting for. The ambulance arrived too late to matter. Bumpy Johnson, the Godfather of Harlem, the man who had protected his community for more than 30 years, was pronounced dead at 10:23 p.m. He was 63 years old. They buried Bumpy Johnson on a gray, overcast Tuesday morning 1 week later. Thousands of people lined the streets of Harlem to watch the funeral procession pass by in respectful silence. Politicians, who had secretly taken his money for years, came dressed in their finest dark suits. Famous musicians, whose careers he had quietly supported, came to pay their final respects. Even police officers, who had accepted his bribes for decades, showed up at the church, looking somber and reflective. Bumpy's widow, Mamie, sat in the front pew, wearing a black veil that hid her grief-stricken face from the curious crowd. Frank Lucas sat alone in the very back of the church, watching everything with dry, calculating eyes. He did not cry. He did not pray. He did not feel the slightest twinge of genuine mourning for the man who had taught him everything he knew. Instead, Frank was thinking about Southeast Asia, about the connections he had been quietly cultivating. Within months of Bumpy's funeral, Frank Lucas traveled to Southeast Asia under a false identity. He made connections in the Golden Triangle, the lawless region where the world's purest heroin originated. According to Frank himself, he established a smuggling network that transported drugs into America through military channels, though federal investigators were never able to fully verify the most sensational details of his claims. What is certain is that by 1970, Frank Lucas had become one of the biggest heroin dealers on the entire East Coast. His organization flooded Harlem with cheap, potent drugs that created an epidemic of addiction and misery. The community Bumpy Johnson had protected for 30 years was systematically destroyed by his own student using the very organizational skills Bumpy himself had taught him. Frank lived lavishly in a New Jersey mansion until federal agents finally arrested him in 1975. He then became a government informant, betraying everyone who had ever trusted him in exchange for a reduced sentence. Frank Lucas died in 2019. Wealthy and unrepentant to the end. Bumpy Johnson died trying to protect his people. Frank Lucas got rich destroying them. That is the difference between a man with a code and a man with only ambition, and Harlem has never forgotten which one was which. Bumpy Johnson spent 2 years teaching Frank Lucas everything he knew about building power and commanding respect. Frank took those lessons and twisted them into something monstrous. He poisoned the very community his mentor had dedicated his entire life to protecting. So here is my question for you. Do you think Bumpy made a mistake trusting Frank? Were there warning signs he should have seen? And in the end, what matters more, the power you build or the principles you keep? Drop your answer in the comments below. If this story moved you, hit that subscribe button right now. We are telling the stories that history tried to bury, and the next one is even more intense.